All right, Benji, we're recording. How's it going?
Good, man. How are you doing?
Doing well. Doing
Sick.
well. Yeah, we took a week off. You had your mother visiting.
Yeah, yeah. She came up. We did some hiking. Drug her around Nevada for a little bit. She took the dog back. It was good business.
Excellent. Well, we're going to dive right back into this. This is the Justin and Benji show. Today we're reading Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut Jr.
Is that how you pronounce it? Is that a German name?
Kurt Vonnegut?
No, Bergeron.
How would you pronounce it?
I have no idea. I was just
Bergeron?
wondering that. Yeah.
I think
Yeah,
it's supposed to be like a
Otherwise it would be Bergeron. Yeah, I
Bergeron.
don't know. Bergeron. I like that better. Bergeron. That's better.
What do you know about Kurt Vonnegut?
I don't know anything about him. I was really into a lot of his. I went through a phase where I read a lot. I've probably read like 10 of his books or more. I've read Player Piano. I've read Slaughterhouse 5. What are some of his other ones? I've definitely read this short story before. I recognized it right away. Oh,
So
I just go ahead.
you two have something in common. You fought in Iraq. He fought in World War II.
Yeah, that was the basis for. It wasn't just Slaughterhouse 5. He did another one too, right?
It's definitely the basis of Slaughterhouse 5. I'm not sure which other one it might be. I did
He's
read.
written so many books.
I read a book called Mother Night that I really loved.
Okay, and that's by him.
Mother Night is about a undercover U.S. agent who was undercover as a Nazi Party member,
Uh huh.
high up in the ranks, and he got tried in Nuremberg and got a life sentence, I believe, because the U.S. government never bailed him out.
Okay.
So I believe the book is his memoir, writing about his story.
Okay. Yeah, I've read so many of his books. I can't even remember what I've read. Cat's Cradle, Breakfast of Champions, The Sirens of Titan, Player Piano, Slapstick. I've read A Man Without a Country. I've read Hocus Pocus. I've read a
Wow.
lot of his books.
Yeah.
But I can't. The Sirens of Titan was pretty good. I seem to recall him mentioning that was like is one of the closest he'll ever get to an autobiography too, since he doesn't seem to be in that. I've read Sun Moon Star. So yeah, I was always a fan of his books. They were always kind of a bit of a zany sort of take on things, but it was in a simplistic fashion that could really drive home his points. And yeah, so anyway, I really like Harrison. How did you want to do it? Did you want to do a page? Did you want me to do
Yeah.
a page?
Yeah. I'll start us off and then we'll just stop at the end of each page.
Okay, yeah. So we'll read this little short story for anyone listening out there. Sounds awesome.
And then we'll discuss at the end.
Perfect.
All right.
And then
Harrison.
Q&A. Just
Yeah.
kidding.
Well, when we get to live streams, we'll do
Yeah,
Q&A.
sounds good. Go
Harrison
ahead, bud.
Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. So the year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the HG men took people, that's handicapped general men, took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was turned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she'd forgotten for the moment what they were about. On the television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled in panic, like bandits from a burglar alarm. That was a real pretty dance, that dance they just did, said Hazel. Huh? Said George. That dance. It was nice, said Hazel. Yep, said George. He tried to think a little about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good, no better than anybody else would have been anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked so that no one seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. George George winced. So did two out of the eight ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball peen hammer, said George. I think it was I think it would be real interesting hearing all the different sounds, said Hazel, a little envious. All the things they think up.
Said George. Only if I was handicapper general. You know what I would do? Said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapper general, a woman named Diana Moonglampers. If I was Diana Moonglampers, said Hazel, I'd have chimes on Sunday, just chimes, kind of in honor of religion. I could think if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe make 'em real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapper general. Good as anybody else, said George. Who knows better than I what normal is? Said Hazel. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son, who was now in jail, about Harrison, but a 21 gun salute in his head stopped that. Boy, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it? It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his red eyes. Two of the eight ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor, were holding their temples. All of a sudden, you look so tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. Go on and rest the bag for a little while, she said. I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while. George weighed the bag with his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me. You've been so tired lately. Kind of wore out, said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and just take out a few of them lead balls, just a few. 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out, said George. I don't call that a bargain. If you could just make a few out when you came home from work, said Hazel. I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around. If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people'd get away with it, and pretty soon we'd be right back to the Dark Ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? I'd hate it, said Hazel. There you are, said George. The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society?
If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to this question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. Reckon it'd fall all apart, said Hazel. What would? Said George blankly. Society, said Hazel uncertainly. Wasn't that what you just said? Who knows, said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first as to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had a serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, and in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, Ladies and gentlemen. He finally gave up, handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read. That's all right, Hazel said of the announcer. He tried. That's the big thing. He tried to do the best that he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard. Ladies and gentlemen, said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful because the mask she wore was hideous. And it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. And she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was a warm, luminous, timeless melody. Excuse me, she said, and she began again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive. Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a grackle squawk, has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete, and is under handicapped, and should be regarded as extremely dangerous. A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen upside down, then sideways, upside down again, then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween in hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the handicapper general men could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him wanging headaches besides. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people. But Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds.
And to offset his good looks, the HG men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random. If you see this boy, said the ballerina, do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him. There was a shriek of a door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison on the screen jumped again and again as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, and well he might have, for many was a time his own home had danced in the same crashing tune. My God, said George, that must be Harrison. The realization was blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George could open his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hand. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. I am the Emperor, cried Harrison. Do you hear? I am the Emperor. Everyone must do what I say at once. He stamped his foot and the studio shook. Even as I stand here, he bellowed, crippled, hobbled, sickened, I am a greater ruler than any man who ever lived. Now watch me become what I can become. Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bar of the padlock that secured his head harness. The bar snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his red ball nose, revealed a man that would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. I shall now select my empress, he said, looking down the cowering people. Let the first woman who dares rise to her feet claim her mate and her throne. A moment passed, and then a ballerina arose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the metal handicap from her ear, snapped off her physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last of all, he removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful.
Now, said Harrison, taking her hand, shall we show the people the meaning of the world, the word dance? Music, he commanded. The musicians scrambled back into their chairs, and Harrison stripped them off their handicaps too. Stripped them of their handicaps too. Play your best, he told them, and I'll make you barons and dukes and earls. The music began. It was normal at first, cheap, silly, false. But Harrison snatched two musicians from their chairs, waved them like batons as he sang the music as he wanted it played. He slammed them back into their chairs. The music began again and was much improved. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weights to their toes. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gambled, and spun. They leaped like deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then Neutral in gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in air, inches below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double barreled 10 cage shotgun. She fired twice, and the Emperor and the Empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them that they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergeron's television tube burned out. Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone out into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with the beer, paused while a handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. You been crying? He said to Hazel. Yep, she said.
What about? He said. I forget, she said. Something real sad on television. What was it? He said. It's all kind of mixed up in my mind, said Hazel. Forget sad things, said George. I always do, said Hazel. That's my girl, said George. He winced. There was a sound of a riveting gun in his head. Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy, said Hazel. You can say that again, said George. Gee, said Hazel. I could tell that one was a doozy. There you go. That's a good one, man. I'd forgotten about that one, but I remembered right away with the handicaps because they seem so overt.
So here we are in the year 2020. 2081 is just 60 years away. And what is there
Yeah.
to say? I mean, there's so much to say, but I don't think we want to get our YouTube channel banned.
No, I know. No, I mean there's a lot we can talk about. I mean right off he kind of explains how it's 2081 and he's talking about the 211th, 12th, and 13th Amendments of the Constitution. And as has been discussed a lot, you know, once you factor in those many and that many amendments, you sort of wash away the original intent of the document, which, you know, under Jeffersonian democracy, I would consider that you know, what would be the main tenet? The government that governs best governs least. So when you get into this amount of amendments, obviously saying that that sort of Jeffersonian idea is no longer alive in Bergeron's world. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, what strikes me is that so the Constitution hasn't been done away with in this land, but rather there's been really kind of pork belly legislation built around it, sort of canceling out the original document. And I think we that actually nicely lays out this is a 1961 short story.
Yep. Let me go to the bottom to the copyright. Yep.
Lays out like what we've actually seen happen is that we still have the Constitution in place, but we have like so many laws and regulations that have been built around it that in many ways, for instance, like here in California, we're 100 miles from the coastline in what's essentially like a as where I'm so close to the border as well that like with certain laws on the books, the Constitution is actually never the law of the land here
Mm-hmm.
because we're so
Mm-hmm.
close to the border. And I think that's an example of kind of what we see here. I think that this story plays on the danger of this notion of equality. Like, I don't think that equality is a virtue. I think fairness is a virtue. The
Mm-hmm.
freedom to
Mm-hmm.
pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Not for all of us to be the same because we're not all the same. In fact, our individualities, the ways in which we're different, are our strengths.
Yeah, what you said there, you know, the whole story talks about everything that's been institutionalized. So you have the dancing, you have the music, you have the TV, you have the can of beer in the refrigerator. You have a lot of institutional notions, but what really looks like it's been done here is that the notion of in favor of equality, the notion that there might be hierarchies gets displaced in Kurt Vonnegut's world here. And but it's kind of it's funny because there's assumptions made even about the hierarchies, because at some point the text says like, well, she must have been the prettiest, best ballerina because she was the most handicapped. And Harrison Bergeron himself was incredibly handicapped. And my one of my favorite parts is when the ballerina was reading for the announcer, because the guy couldn't even do his own job. Was the sentence she used was, he's smart, he's intelligent and good looking, don't try to reason with him. Because the assumption there is that he'd be a better reasoner, so trying to reason with him would mean that all things wouldn't be equal in that hierarchy either.
The fact that the newscaster should be commended for having tried reminds me of growing up playing baseball, and no matter how bad the team was, we always got a participation trophy. And I
Okay.
I, I look back at that now, and I think that that's just like kind of like poison to a young child's mind.
Right.
Like, it's, look, first of all, it's just a recreational baseball league, so like
Uh-huh.
it's not a big deal if you lose it in the first place, and therefore like it shouldn't even be a big deal if you get a plastic trophy
Mm-hmm.
anyway. And and I don't really ever have remember having a competitive edge of trying to like win the recreational baseball league for better or worse. But certainly, perhaps if there had not always been this standard where everyone gets a trophy, maybe I would have had a better consciousness of like, hey, let's try to win for the sake of winning and just having some fun,
Right. Right.
playing
I
more
you
games.
Sometimes I wonder if those trophies weren't part and a big part for the parents as well. That the parents got their trophies for taking their kids to little league practice, even though they were tired after work, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's funny because I'm not necessarily, I hear a lot about competitive people, and I'm trying to open a restaurant. So I listen to a lot of restaurateurs and entrepreneurs talk, and they talk about there's different types of competitiveness. Maybe you're competitive against yourself, maybe you're competitive against some sort of inanimate object. Like, definitely for me, I was never, I was kind of averse to sports anyway. I was always averse to kind of, team things, or like, let's all huddle around, and it just wasn't me. And I'm not knocking it, I'm just saying it wasn't me. I was a part of marching band, and I was a part of marching band in Texas at a time, and I think this is still true to the day because my brother follows a lot of this. uh we were, not me, I just wanted to whatever play trumpet, but we were an incredibly dedicated, disciplined, overworked, underpaid, underappreciated unit of, some 150 people. And my my brother and I both experienced that, and he went on to do Drum Corps International, which is even more intense. But that sort of discipline, and was almost military in a way. And I would say that you, all in all, were better for it, provided you could get over the hangups of like, if you're not the best, you're nothing. Like, you have to identify with the process more of like becoming the best, and that sort of competitive edge I can see as very worthwhile in people. Because when you equalize everyone, so like it says, like, he takes off the ballerina's handicaps, and she was strikingly beautiful and talented, and could dance and could kiss the ceiling, and et cetera, et cetera. And like George himself could even speak his own music that he wanted into existence by talking with these people. There's nothing to say that all the people that weren't watching TV, most of them are going to stack up at the bottom. They're not going to be the best ballerinas or musicians or competitive players, but the inspiration that is given to all of those people to become something better was immediately introduced. And of course, a handicapping general had came in and stopped that violently and immediately.
She doesn't
And
seem to have too many handicaps.
No. Well, that's a good point. I didn't even think of that till you brought it up. I mean, she had a 10 gauge shotgun and she could obviously draw a bead. So
Hmm.
it's like, and I
Without
don't
her.
know. I mean, if and uh to anyone who hasn't fired a shotgun, the 10 gauge is a big one.
So this notion that competition and cooperation are mutually exclusive, I think, is misled. I think that there's a lot of elements of cooperation within competition and vice versa. So I guess at their purest moments, I don't think um, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney were cutthroat competitors, but they had this like healthy competition in which they like spurred themselves to challenge one another. Yeah.
So do you think your experience with baseball and the little leagues, and because you've always kind of liked baseball and you've liked sports, do you feel like your experience in little leagues, you said you weren't competitive, so how do I phrase this? Did it help you? Did it make you want to be competitive or less competitive? Like, what did the trophy do for you as a person? Did it do anything, or was it a throwaway piece?
Well, it was, I think, both. It was a throwaway piece, but also I never had a competitive bone in my body, and I wish that I had.
Okay.
So this notion of like being a competitor was, I was not bad at baseball for most of my like the
Uh-huh.
years that I
Uh-huh.
played, but I never was competitive, and I think that that was a weakness on the baseball field, and it translated into life in some ways. And this is with this is uh containing this notion that like with competition comes cooperation, right? Like on a major league baseball field in Game 7 of the World Series, these guys aren't killing each other. They're actually all friends.
Right.
They're just cooperating in the setting of competition or whatever. But like I was never competitive in baseball. I think it spilled over into real life, and I wish I had more of this competitive like impulse. And today I've it's awakened in me to where like I have more of a competitive edge, you know.
So nature versus nurture. Do you think that the competitive edge was maybe something that had been dampened in you that you've had to rekindle? Do you think that you had to rekindle it from nothing, just knowing that it would be beneficial to you in your life? Because it seems like more, more, the competition seems necessary in some respects to drive us to higher heights. So where do you see yourself in into that?
I think that it it's my sense is that there was a lot of nurture there. Like baseball, it was I took up a bunch of my time, and it was never a competitive endeavor. It was like a game.
Uh
It
huh.
was something that you played. But like I was always on mediocre teams, and I wonder like,
Right.
and I don't think I also got the most out of my talents because of this lack of this competitive nature, which I think to a degree it was in my nature, but it could have been awakened much younger.
Okay. Yeah, I hear it. Yeah. So when you said mediocre teams, that really struck me because growing up, like I think I did it all, like baseball, football, like everything in little leagues growing up in elementary school. And like I said, it was never really something I enjoyed doing. But I think I was on a football team in fifth grade where like we lost every single game. Like we were never good, and it's too it's too far away in my memory or probably my understanding of that time to understand why that happened. But I would guess and be really confident in my guess that a distinct part of that is because other teams were instilled with a more competitive winning drive than we were, and so that gave them the impetus to have more effort. So I mean, I grew up distinctly with it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. But I never knew what that meant, and I think it translated to my brain like winning or losing isn't important, which is a funny lesson to give a kid, especially if you're a human, because when you go to the fundamentals of what life is, it's like, well, if you live and you're somewhat stable and happy, like that's winning. That's actual winning, because if the tiger eats you, it's losing, and we're so far divorced by with that, in the modern terms. I almost think that you could relate the tiger almost now to like mental neuroses of anxieties and depression. Like you're losing because the tiger is winning because you don't understand what you're doing in the fight. Like if there's no context or meaning to what you're doing, I mean, for me, I don't know about you. Like I was talking to a friend about this the other day. Like I have to know why. And it's how to play the game. How you play the game isn't a why to like a fourth grader, I don't think, unless they're extremely sophisticated. And I guess I wasn't. It was just like, oh, be fair, be good, because that's what people do for other people. And there wasn't a concrete moral dedication that would have, say, transform that baseball game or football game into a real life application where you could extrapolate important learning moments and apply that sort of microcosm of little league game to like the meta game of life, and in that little league game, what's the point of winning? Well, I think for me, a lot of that mentality translated into my actual life. And I had serious stuck points I worked out with psychotherapists, particularly with my PTSD training. That was like, one of them was, if you can't do something excellently, do not even attempt it. And I think that Bergeron, that they're like, oh, well, everyone can attempt it because the truly excellent people are going to be handicapped. But it's like, who, honestly, like who wants to watch that ballerina show? Like when you think of ballerinas as a perfect counterpoint to what Vonnegut is saying as these graceful, majestic humans that have executed motor output to a minute degree where every gesture of a fingertip or toe is incredibly enjoyable because we like watching other people. When you put leaden weights on them, you can just kind of see them flopping around the stage, like some sort of horrible TikTok video.
The land in which this story takes place is post-human in a way, or anti-human. It's anti our most graceful attributes. But I wanted to kind of lean into this, like losing a baseball game is almost like getting eaten by a tiger. That strikes with me because when I graduated college, I did get a job, but most of my life has been entrepreneurial. And man, I cannot tell you how many times the market has punched me in the teeth.
Uh-huh.
And if I had more of this competitive like notion, or even just skepticism about like other people's intentions, I could have avoided some of that. However, like now 10 years later, fast forward 10 years later, and like I'm aware that there's
Right.
sharks in the water, and I
Mm-hmm.
won't let the sharks eat me. And I'm not going to become a shark, but I have zero problems like, killing a predatorial shark coming at me. And that drive is something that I did not develop until 10 years in the market setting, which is the
Uh-huh.
meta life.
Game punched in the teeth.
Yeah, life punched me right in the teeth, potentially because I had been given too many plastic trophies as a kid.
Yeah, well, I can see that, and as we said before, we both went to a specific type of, Linfield was private.
Yes.
Yeah, private liberal arts school where honestly, like I think you could have fall down and died on your way to pick up your diploma and they would have chiseled it into your tombstone for you. So there was really, at my school, there was no losing unless you didn't want to be a part of the group. And I really see that as a predicated thought for what's happening in Vonnegut's world in 2081. It's sort of it's a collective idea that if someone is better at something than you, it's going to make you feel bad. And because it makes you feel bad at a very shallow interpretation, it's like, oh, okay, well, we should address that person feels bad, we should address that because the person that won, they're not feeling bad, so that doesn't seem to be an issue or a concern. The problem is, to alleviate that person's feeling bad, you're not punishing the person that feels bad, you're punishing the person that feels good, because you're dragging them down to a certain level of what would be ineptitude for anyone that's practiced at any skill, motor output, thought wise, anything. And that doesn't seem to be that seems to be the what that was my experience in college, where I think again and again and again I asked my teachers for, like, I need to do more, like I am seriously concerned about, like, publishing my thoughts, right? It's subjects. And
You're cutting out.
but telling me, and it was
Can you
okay.
hear me, Benji? You're cutting out a
Yeah,
bit.
yeah, I can hear you. Are you good?
Yeah, you cut out a little bit there, but
That I think that was my bad. I think my computer went to sleep. I need to play with the settings to make it last longer.
oh yeah, no problem. That's great. Yeah, so it's um so if it's try to say some of that again, or summarize it a bit.
Well, my experience in college was much like Harrison's, where I felt that anytime I wanted to pursue something that was a complicated thesis that would have required lots of time and effort, like, I don't think any of my teachers understood the amount of time and effort I was willing to put into a subject. And what happened was that I ended up just going through all these hoops, with all the other students, and I would get stickers for all these things that I didn't feel accomplished in doing. I can give you a perfect example. I'm trying to open this restaurant, and everyone's like, "Hey, Ben, this is hard, blah blah blah," and I'm like, "Well, that's great because that's what I want." And I've had definitely a lot of trip ups in life. One thing my mother always told me was, you went through boot camp, you can get through anything. And one thing I always thought was, that's exactly something that someone would say who's never been through Marine Corps boot camp. Because I truly believe, as long as you can hurriedly run in the opposite direction of whatever's yelling at you and you can keep breathing, just about everyone can graduate Marine Corps boot camp. It's not in the military's best interest to have a super high attrition rate at their what's theirs entering criteria. And so when I wanted to self challenge in college and I wanted to kind of break out of this box, I was severely hampered. So I don't know. Did you track with all that?
Yeah, and my experience in college was gr- very well. I was the paying first of all, and then second of all, like
Yeah, I felt
po-
like that too. Like, I'm paying you. Like, you have your job security. Like,
polite. Yeah,
you work for me, and they did not think that.
they were polite,
Yeah.
but thinking outside of the box certainly wasn't something that they wanted to do. Perhaps that put their job on the line.
Hmm. Hmm.
Actually put their sense of security in life on the line. I mean, we had a show question the official story. We were taken off the air when we started questioning that the bankers were getting $1 trillion bailouts. For example, I was called irreverent by a history teacher, and irreverent means that you don't respect the institutions, of authority.
Yeah.
And I respect this teacher quite a bit, Scott Smith, the late Scott Smith. He passed away at a young age, and I learned so much from him about the Soviet Union,
Uh huh.
about Nazi Germany,
Uh huh.
but at the same time, he and I came to wildly different conclusions about how that could be applied today. And in fact, it wasn't in the curriculum to apply that today. And so, as perhaps more as curious types like you and I are, we're a little bit like Harrison in this story because his strength is reasoning. And you mentioned that they're bringing everyone down to the equal levels and not bringing people up, which I think in order to do that, you have to tell them to lean into their strengths. What is your strength? What is your passion? Do that. Don't try to like improve your weaknesses, hone your strength. And Gary Vaynerchuk talks about this.
Yeah, yeah. He helped me a lot in that.
And so then, like in this story, like they're bringing everyone else down instead of like telling Harrison to lean into his strengths, reason, thinking, um, and instead just kind of like knocking him down, knocking also uh, George down.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, and so yeah, they he does hint that it's sort of a hereditary thing by having that there, right? And the that so that was huge for me when I learned to say like double down on my strengths and stop trying to fix my weaknesses. And I've had an incredible catalyst in this in the last month because I'm inherently, well, my psychometrics, I was in the 0 percentile for industriousness, orderliness, and conscientiousness. Like, it's not that I don't like doing things. I love to do things. I want to do them all the time, but like I'm incredibly unorganized. And where my brain takes me, it's a juggernaut. So trying to steer that ship has been incredibly difficult for me. And I was trying, or say, all sorts of things that worked for people who weren't me. And I spent years years and years just not doing that well. And then when I decided to just throw caution to the wind, basically, and to trust in what I was good at and start setting up microsystems to the point where I really lacked, like, that was awesome, but it's about honing your strengths. I always compare it to a video game, like, or building a character on a video game, because if you're like this past Saturday, yesterday, I every 2 weeks I play Dungeons and Dragons, and you build a character, and that character is based on randomness, and then you have some sort of an option to put where you want your character's strengths to be and where the weaknesses are. And in a game, you have the advantage of strategically creating that. In life, you're just born with it, and you're given what you're given, and you're nurtured what you're nurtured. And so to start adjusting those parameters around your life, it's so important, but in no way, I pass the psychometric test around a lot and have people take it and share their results with me. I'll send you a voucher. And if you haven't already taken it, and people are always, so are you trying to get your like low scores higher, or your higher scores lower? And the answer is like, not any of that. Like, one, I think it's the wrong mentality to say like, oh, this is a high score and this is a low score. Like, it's a distribution. And even some of my high scores, like, quote unquote, like I was really high in neuroticism and rumination. Well, obviously, like, I want to bring that down, and I want to bring orderliness up. But for my openness and my intellect, they were really high scores, but I just want to keep honing those and pushing them, pushing them, pushing them. So it's more about adjusting your personality to your life goals. What do you want? Then go for that. But I think a lot of people, Harrison knew what he wanted, and his parents did not, per se. Or maybe George never had a chance because he had that buzzer going off in his ear every time he was thinking about it. But I really like what about that, Gary V. Double down on your strengths. Your weaknesses are always going to inhibit you, but you can overcome them. That's what you're saying about competition. Like, you weren't inherently, but after a while, you get sick of getting punched in the teeth. And if you can identify one of the key factors as being this or that, then you can directly confront that problem, and people can change. I believe that in my soul, not the least of which because I've done it myself.
I was raised by a public servant, and I was told to become a public servant too.
Uh-huh.
And so I
Uh-huh.
had not an entrepreneurial bone in my body. But I think today that I probably have a better sense about how I can personally steer the entrepreneurial world because
Uh-huh.
I kept getting back up and trying to get improve. However, I want to kind of like, as we wrap up here, there's an elephant in the room in this story. Everyone's got a handicap that is mandated by the government to wear.
Uh-huh.
Is this the Harrison Bergeron universe equivalent of like Neuralink or some of these like types of technologies that we hear so much about today? Now, of course, Neuralink is marketed as a way into which improve people's weaknesses. Like, for instance, if you can't see, Neuralink might be able to help you see, or if you have Parkinson's disease, it might be able to help you gain control of your motor function. But of course, there is a darker side, a darker potential, if you will.
There is a big dark side to that application, and I truly believe that because you always have to pay a price. Is Neuralink, is that Elon Musk, or is that the DoD's
Well, it's
DARPA?
okay. So DARPA's got something that must be way ahead of what Elon has, but
Okay.
Neuralink is particularly what Elon's working on.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think DARPA is way ahead in that. Um, I think they can even introduce you to nanites that will form their own circuitry in the body on their own. So it's very, very sci-fi, very Star Trek. Uh, I, yeah, that application is always there. I'll tell you, there. I think a lot of it comes down to the individual, and I was a person that resisted technology for a very long time, and it was through the philosophy of Stoicism, and particularly one of, I think it's the fifth letter that Seneca wrote to Lucilius, that I begrudgingly adopted technology because it was pointless for me to try to get my message out in a technological world without utilizing technology. And so look at us right here, and our microphones and webcams. However, right, I've had to severely discipline myself because I have, like I'm sure everyone has, wasted God knows how many untold years on scrolling through things, or scrolling through, so or finding little dopamine boosts, or you know, this or that. So anyway, I particularly am not, you know, I don't think the internet needs to be improved upon. I am of that camp. I was of the camp that libraries didn't need to be improved upon. I was perfectly happy with the card catalog and the way that was set up. In fact, I think the card catalog was a little more advantageous than the internet, because when you're on the internet, you're always getting nudged and prompted. You're getting search queue suggestions. That can be a very powerful tool that can save you a lot of time. But there was this sort of whimsical beauty about the card catalog, that you were just thumbing through and you went to a section in the library that you liked, and you could pull out several books. So the danger is there. The application is there. I mean, you and I both know several authors, including Brzezinski and other technocrats, that have written about the ability to use the application in a sort of handicapping manner. Certainly, I experienced and saw firsthand how technology was used in it. And I'm talking about like soft technology, not like a bullet, but like audio waves were used to disrupt the Iraqis when we were in Iraq. And it the double-edged sword is very, very real. And I think part of that elephant in the room was, it was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the emperor and the empress were dead before they hit the floor. So here she's kind of the technocrat, right? But the thing is, like, in every single character you have before this little paragraph, and this is why I think Vonnegut's beautiful. Everyone's described with the Everyone's described first by the handicaps they have on them. And what gives you an idea of the personality or character of the people is how many handicaps they have on them. So the emperor and the empress in this story had the most handicaps, but when Diana busts in, she's the handicapper general. She doesn't have any. She's purely an enforcer. So Diana is the dark side of the application, because and that's always going to be the case, that the dark side is going to have way more power and accessibility than the light side, I would say, to use Star Wars terms.
You alluded to social media and cell phone scrolling, and in a way this is our handicap.
I know it. I know it. Yeah.
You mentioned this part, and I kind of maybe want to end here, uh,
Okay.
where Diana Moonglampers busts in. Now she busts in the most human moment of the story, and I'll read
Yes.
that. This is when we get our most tasteful or juicy glimpse into the humanness that's still around. And so Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity and the law of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gambled, and spun. They leaped like deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutraling gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in air inches below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long, long time. That is what it means to be human.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's when the handicapper general bursts in and kills them.
It explodes out of the story, like you said. I mean, it's such a unique segment of the story because you really get put right back into the setting when you go to George and Hazel on the couch. I mean, you're right back in the drabness of a world like this.
And by the time you get back to them, they've already forgotten what happened.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's so human too. That, you know,
And in
that
fact, George didn't even stick around to see it for whatever reason, right? Because
well,
George
he
was
wanted to
getting
go
a
get a
beer.
beer. Yeah, he wanted to go get a beer. Yeah, so he missed it. So like he was just kind of like, oh, I mean, I think I remember that from Tell Me What Happens as you run to grab a soda or something when you're a kid, because it's
Yeah.
like you don't really care about the meta element that's on the television. You're just still only concerned with instant gratification.
And so, like, in a sense, he's lucky because he didn't have to witness the murder of his son.
Well, ignorance is bliss. Yeah, in a sense, you're totally right there.
Wow. Well, any other thoughts,
I,
Benji?
well, I really like doing this with you. I think you hit the nail on the head with reading these short texts and analyzing them. And we've done two so far. There's many more that we'll cover, but both of these have been absolutely awesome, awesome, awesome. I was thrilled to read this short story again. I mean, I just love it. Geez, said Hazel. I could tell that one was a doozy. Everything's so. I just love Vonnegut because it's so like it's so ridiculous. I mean, it's so satirical that you would have like actual like lead shot tied around your ankles, but that it makes it such a visual. I guess what I was trying to say in the beginning, I love Vonnegut because the absurdities just enhance those moments when the two are they're kissing the ceiling, and he even uses tyrannical terms for them. That's what's so brilliant. They're the emperor and the empress, like they're tyrannical, but they're an example of maybe what the Greeks would have called a good tyranny. But there's something to strive for, and that's what seemed to upset the handicapper the most. Like it directly against her job title. Like she didn't want anyone striving or getting uppity because that upsets the order of the system. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a larger argument to talk about how civilizations stabilize and destabilize and how that's a stable pattern that any artificial society, like we read from the Republic last week, that's basically what the Republic is entirely about, is how do you keep a cohesive artificial system stable in nature, because that never happens. Entropy is the law. Stability is not the law. The only constant in the universe is change. So, yeah, in 2081, man, seems like a pretty drab place to live. I don't know what you think.
Well, I hope we both make it there and we'll be in our 90s and we can sit down and then compare.
Yeah, our 1010th episode. It'll be way more than that by then. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, let's do it, man. Let's do it. I love
All
it. Thank you for inviting me on this again. This kind of made my evening. It was a lot of fun.
right. Thanks everyone for joining us.